Here? Okay. Good morning. I really appreciate the privilege of being able to speak here. And as the Vice Chancellor was speaking, I reminded myself that without some of the research, the investment, the inventions, I wouldn't actually be here. And I have an implantable cardioverter defibrillator inside me, and I have a left ventricle that might as well not be there. And not that long ago, maybe 30 years ago, having gone through VFib a few times in my life, I would have had no right to be alive or exist or look forward to seeing my grandchildren. So you may have many theoretical reasons for doing what you do, but understand that some of the research, some of the inventions that come out, some of the innovations that come out allow people like me to stand here and talk to you. Right? Every day I have to figure out what's happening. I mean, it also means I can have a lot of fun because I can read my device. They haven't given me the right to write to that device as yet. I hope one day they will, but every 3 months I have to go into a pacing clinic and almost play sort of speeding up my heart and slowing it down. And you don't need drugs when you can do something like that, with controls that sort of make that happen. And to know that it started in British universities in around 1899 and came through. If you want a reminder, I'm standing here in front of you. There's something else, because when I was young, one of the reasons why I do what I do was that my father told me something that completely depressed me no end, and yet made me think there has got to be an answer to this, which was that I might be part of the first generation in human history whose children would have a lower lifespan than me. Okay? That scared me. The idea of even what was known and visible in the 60s began to allow people to think about peak longevity. I never want to even consider that as possible, but 50-odd years on, when I look at what's happening around me in the world, part of the way to prevent that from becoming true is in rooms like this one. So, be aware that many of the challenges we face require, the new types of challenge require new types of solutions. And without that, we may have a generation to look forward to who actually will live less long than I would, which is a scary thing for me to even think about. So it isn't just about my personal life, it's about what we can do to change the direction of humanity. It's easy for me to stand up here and say all this. I was in the Nilgiri Hills on vacation in March, April. And one of the places I went to was the crash site of a Hungarian mathematician, a guy called Abraham Wald. And Abraham Wald was a truly crazy person. Right? As a young student, he was working in mathematics and statistics, and the job he was given, because of the nature of the environment he was in, was to help figure out how to make sure that planes lasted longer, warplanes returned from their sorties. And received wisdom at the time was that you looked very carefully at the planes that returned, where all the damage was, where all the bullet holes were, and then you reinforced those areas that had taken the maximum damage. And that had been received wisdom for quite a while. And as a young man, he walked in, and he looked at that and said, I don't think this makes sense. Why are we reinforcing these places by the mere fact that the planes are returning? They're strong enough. We should be reinforcing the places where there are no bullet holes, because the planes don't make it back. Okay? A young man, a different perspective, completely transformed the way the industry looked at how to manage and repair those planes. In some ways, that's what you represent to me, people who have the ability. Why I'm standing here is to hope at the end of my 40 minutes that I've given you a slightly different perspective so that you can, through the rest of today and through the rest of your lives, give that different perspective to the rest of us. Because you don't have the anchors and frames that I would. The common sense in that sense, as Einstein said, was just the collection of prejudices you get by age 18. And then we've got to work quite hard as to how to get rid of that common sense. And part of what you do is to have the intelligence to know what those frames are, what those anchors are, and how to remove them from your thinking so that you can be free. So here's my view on what's happening around us, which I hope will give you a framework to look at what the rest of the day is about. By the way, can I walk around, or am I required to be here for, okay, I do have to stand here. That's it's a challenge for me. Okay. I think of what's happening around here really as the result of two primary drivers. One driver is what has already been referred to a couple of times earlier today in the introductions, and that's effectively the transistor, the cell, the chip, the ability for digitization to take place in one form or the other, the digital revolution, Moore's law, as you heard it, etc. It's a critical driver, and it's not new. By the way, how many of you here were born after the 3rd of April, 1973? Okay, just to put yourself in your place, you're younger than my mobile phone. Okay? Okay? That was the day the world's first mobile phone call was made, not when the technology was visualized or anything else. Right? That was the day Marty Cooper rang Joel Engel. So some of the technologies we use today are well established, but one of the primary drivers, as I said, was the digital revolution. The second primary driver is also important. The Vice Chancellor referred to the implications and importance, how we look at investment and all this, but the public policy that allowed human beings to be able to migrate, that allowed capital to be able to migrate, that allowed ideas to be able to migrate, that is part and parcel of what made the world we live in possible. So these two things coming together, the rollout of digital infrastructure and the freeing up of public policy, set the background. And this freeing up took place pretty much as a result of and the outcome of thinking during and after the Second World War. And that has created an environment where much of what we have today is able to happen, where people have the freedom to connect, where people have the freedom to share, where people have the freedom to express themselves. And I'll sort of come on to each of these to try and set the tone for the rest of the day. People like John Hagel and John Seeley Brown at the Deloitte Center for the Edge, they refer to what is happening right now as the big shift. Okay? And they characterize this big shift by saying there's a dramatically increased competitive intensity. And I translate that to saying, well, barriers to entry are sharply reduced. And these barriers to entry matter. I mean, if you have a startup challenge, part of the reason why you can have startups is because many of the barriers to entry that would have existed 100 years ago, 70 years ago, 50 years ago, not just are reducing, but continue to reduce. Right? And that's important to me personally, and it should be important to all of you in understanding who gets enfranchised as a result of the inventions and innovation, who is disenfranchised and needs to be taken care of, because that creation of level playing fields is a material part of, the David Weinberger, another of my favorite authors, said, the smartest person in the room is the room. Okay? And we have to learn how to empower rooms, not just random individuals who appear to have the privilege to be able to do something. Yes, we all have privileges, but being able to look carefully at what disenfranchises and choosing how we can act to remove those barriers is a critical element. But thankfully, the last 70 years has been helping do that for us. The second thing they said is, as a result of this shifting competitive intensity to a much larger level is that margins are much harder to create. Okay? Big businesses are finding it harder to make money. And in the introduction, my company was referred to as being the most innovative according to Forbes. In fact, it was for the last 2 years running. But part of the challenge is how you innovate in austerity, how you make the money count, because we don't have infinite capital. The 40% per annum perpetual return that was referred to, I mean, that made me start taking notes. Until then, I was listening. Okay? Because those are the sort of things that can help us change what is happening now, being able to quantify. Which brings me on to where I want to connect these dots, where I think we're going. Okay? One piece that we got is that everything is able to get connected. Okay? When I say everything, I start imagining the world to be one where everything is a node on the network, not just us as human beings, not just devices. We're not entering the Internet of Things per se. It goes beyond that to saying it has now become possible for us to be able to connect even ideas and concepts and make them, when your tweets are able to tweet, right? That's when you realize the power of what happens today. A tweet can tell me today, you haven't read me while 3 of your friends have. I suggest you read me now. Okay? That kind of capacity to say you can, you don't just follow friends, you can follow concepts. Right? At work, you can follow a complaint or a bill to its completion. You can follow an order. Right? Imagine what happens in Medicare when you're able. Last year, because I seem to collect some of these things, I had a relatively large tumor in my colon. And the chances of survival weren't put particularly high. But the technology was such that I could keep very much abreast of what's happening. The risk factors were quite clearly understood. Because I had a pacemaker and I was on anticoagulants, it took a little more care as to that kind of invasive operation before I could deal with it. But it gave me the chance dispassionately to watch what happens in that kind of medical environment for the best part of 2.5 weeks. And what I learned during that time was how much compared to my grandmother who had the same tumor in 1965, and she survived for 40 years after that. But the kind of damage done to her that it took her nearly 4 years to recover, to become active, whereas I was back at work in 2 weeks. Right? That time compression is also a creation of value in a way that recovery time matters. The ability to continue in that form matters. Going back to this first thing, connectivity. When everything is a node on the network, when everything, and I don't just mean people or things, as I said, including concepts, you start being able to do things that you couldn't do beforehand. You start creating what people now call the if this then that environment, which is real magic. If the doorbell rings and the only person in the house is my aged aunt who can't hear, then please switch on the light next to the television because that's where she's likely to be. Okay? Those are the sort of conditions and constraints you can place where every stimulus, you can sit down and create thresholds as to when an action takes place somewhere else. Right? We have a multiplicity of devices that we can actually relay these messages to. Right? When people talk about everything being connected, that's what creates the ability to have something like big data even being spoken of. Because we have a lot of sensors, we have a lot of quantifying tools. Right? I am, in that sense, heading towards becoming a quantified self person, because I can go into my pacing clinic or even upload the data off my pacemaker, read what I was doing on the 2nd of August at 11 a.m., and correlate that to where I checked in on Twitter and what I said I was doing at the time, if I so chose. But this idea that everything I do can be quantified in that form or shape, Right? When people use terms like big data, I only remember two things I was told very early about even the term. Because many terms get overused, misused. One, it's about rows and not columns. Okay, we're not talking about more complex data, we're just talking about a larger scale. And need to understand that that's what big is. We've always had lots of data. If you want to look at geologists and seismologists and astrophysicists, it's not the first time we've dealt with large quanta of data. Big data is big because it's about rows and not columns. And we've learned a lot about columns and not rows. The second element is that it's about correlation and not causality. Okay? The speed at which we're able to connect dots to be able to understand things, we're going through pattern recognition. But these are things that are only made possible because we have a world full of sensors. And these sensors matter. The nature of how we start engaging with information is changing the way we can interpret the information being gathered. Most people still find it hard to believe that the iPad is only 3 years and a couple of months old. Okay? 3 years. We think of tablets as part of our lives. But the change that made, which somehow the iPhone didn't quite make, the change that made is that a technology that had to be in the way of any human being being able to engage with information, QWERTY, had finally been seen off. Right? Until then, you could not be a child prodigy unless you could conquer the keyboard. Right? The keyboard was an essential artificial bridge between you and your ability to engage for the last 80, 90 years. I grew up in a family of journalists. Right? There were typewriters all over the place. And now, what you have is not only no keyboard necessary, but a 1-year-old is able to engage because the natural instincts of being able to pinch or zoom or tap, these are not things that are artificially learned. That's reduced the barriers to entry. That has enfranchised a generation a number of years earlier. And it doesn't end at that. My kitten knows how to use my iPad. Okay? Believe it or not, there are games available that a kitten can play. And when you watch kittens, it's quite interesting because first they see the flies going around across the pad. They know that if they hit the fly, a noise emerges, sort of Pavlovian. They start learning how to do that. But after a while, they get bored with it. And the next thing they want to know is where are these things coming from? So they pick the iPad up and try to look underneath it. Right? The same child which would get into trouble if she put a palm print on a TV screen 5 years ago is now expecting the screen to talk back. So we have gone through from character-based engagement through graphic engagement to touch. Sound is upon us, gesture. And sound and gesture, by the way, were sort of shown to me 30-odd years ago. These are, again, not new. But they're reaching commercial significance. And that means that as they become more affordable, as they become smaller, faster, cheaper, better, the impact of these is to have a more empowered group of people being able to do things they could not do before, right? Which then leads on to saying this quantification that it allows us to do is quantification not just of the self. We're learning more about the biome. We're trying to figure out whether as human beings we're just vehicles for the billions of organisms that we are transporting around, and we're just kidding ourselves to think it's all about us. Okay? We understand something about the chronic diseases that are actually immune system imbalances that we haven't been able to solve in the past, and I was delighted to hear that some of you in this room are working on those things, but it's a completely different change for how we even look at medical. Okay? We're now going back to holistic and wellness type approaches because it's not point solutions for individual diseases anymore, but an understanding of the body in balance. Partly because we can. Okay? We haven't been able to do that before. Rather than think the rest of the world was stupid before we got there, we have to understand that this miniaturization of sensors, this ability to reduce barriers to entry to touch technology, this ability for people to get connected together, is creating an information base that we couldn't before. I mean, let me give you a business example, okay? Historically, the only way companies could talk to customers or hear customers, more importantly, was in the past tense. Because the cost of recording what a customer was saying, doing, or did was very high. So what would happen is you would have to build infrastructure in order to be able to listen to the customer. And the easiest way to listen to the customer was in the past tense. Okay? So much so that the industry I joined was called transaction processing, because that's all we did. We processed transactions. We understood something about what a customer did after she did it. Okay? Only after. And past predicts the future nonsense sort of drove much of business. Okay? A woman called Mary Modal tells a story in one of her books in the late 20th century about this Ford dealership in Hicksville, USA, where the dealership was full of green Ford pickups. And as little old ladies do in stories like this, she goes up, but she wants a white Ford pickup. The salesman's a great salesman. So by the time she leaves, she's got a green Ford pickup. He's such a good salesman that by the weekend, he sold all the green Ford pickups. And every day he's been calling head office to say, you know what, my market needs white Ford pickups. And someone at head office looks at the data and says, spike in green Ford pickup sales, let's build more of them. Okay? Because we only had the technology to understand what had happened, and we were trying to project from that. Then what happened is that technology got cheaper, right? Every one of us started carrying devices that allowed us to express what we were doing. And suddenly we went into this mode of, I've just had breakfast, I've checked in at McDonald's, you know, I'm just going to the loo, too much information, right? But while people were criticizing that, what was actually happening was a pioneering of a different form. Okay? A new type of map maker was being formed because GPS locations were now being labeled. Those labels were being shared and improved and verified. And the labels were being associated with notes. So suddenly, almost like the 16th and 17th century, you know, I'm always reminded of the fact that the Red Indian is called the Red Indian because Columbus thought he had found India. Okay, he seemed to have turned right rather than left somewhere on a strip. But in those days, if you look at 16th and 17th century maps, they were not quite what we see today. Okay, our information about what our landscape looks like has changed. The same is true of the digital landscape, the same is true of our bodies, the same is true of the biome. We are learning to be able to identify and describe and label, create a taxonomy and ontology for things. You know, at the same time as we can get much smaller because we are sort of becoming micro and nano and so many things we are able to do. Right? At the same time, by the way, I've had a number of interventions on my body, and I don't know whether you guys know it, but if your blood pressure is really low, they can't afford to give you a general anesthetic. And if they're working around your heart, they can't afford to give you a local anesthetic. So some of these operations get done with no anesthetic at all, right? Which has a few negatives. So you have to have a pain threshold, but a few positives you can watch, okay? And I have watched things go into my body and around, reinventing the incredible journey of my childhood films, actually being able to watch what my arteries look like, understanding the scarring on my sort of heart, actually being able to view it rather than be out to the count. So there are some advantages to these things. Now, when we start being able to get to this sort of micro level of understanding and start mapping and creating these sort of environments, what you also start doing is being able to listen to the customer now in the present tense. Okay? So think of customer as patient, think of customer as citizen, think of customer as responsible citizen. It doesn't matter whether you're in energy, it doesn't matter whether you're in government, it doesn't matter whether you're in health, it doesn't matter whether you're in education. We are suddenly able to have more granular, active measurement of things that we didn't have. Now, some people start getting all hassled about the privacy elements of this, etc. And I want to separate between privacy and anonymity. Okay? Privacy is when Someone knows what I'm doing, and I trust that person is not going to misuse that and not going to blab to the world. And we've always had privacy associated with trust. Anonymity is the right to detach yourself from accountability for what you're doing because you want actions to take place that cannot be connected to you. When I was a child, anonymity was, oh, this person's wearing a mask. Is he a bank robber or is he a terrorist? Okay? The freedom fighters I saw didn't look anonymous to me. I could see their faces. Most of them, I knew their names. They lived in history. They were pretty anonymous. Okay? Privacy was a completely different kettle of fish altogether. And I just want you guys to consider one idea in this, because as you learn to quantify and measure things, and many of the discussions you're going to have later this morning and afternoon will have to do with aggregating information in ways where this issue will keep coming up. Just think about one thing. Until about the 1830s, most of us lived, I mean, ever since we found the concept of settlements attractive, most of us lived in small villages and towns, and we died within 10 miles of where we were born. Okay? Because mobility was expensive, migration costs were high. And when we did that, you know, it was normal for everybody to know everybody and everything about everybody. Right? Even in Calcutta, where I was born in 1957, if I walked to my local cigarette shop and asked for a packet of cigarettes at the age of 6, as one does, the shopkeeper gave me the cigarettes because he knew it was for my dad. He knew what brand to give me, which I wouldn't necessarily have known, and he didn't ask me for any money. There was trust and investment in a relationship. And most communities worked with that. There was a collective responsibility that took place that kept that community together. If your barn burnt down, then the rest of the community housed you and fed you and helped you rebuild your barn. The premium you paid was to the community, and the insurance policy paid out by the community responding. Right? The social fabric was about community and being joined together and sharing. And then, about 130 years ago, we slowly began to have devices that allowed us to migrate further and further. Our first iterations of settlements as we migrated were Chinatown, Greek Quarter, Italian Quarter. We recreated our communities where we went. But within 100 years, we saw other things. Oh, it is possible to actually go live in a big city and not know the person to the left of you and not know the person to the right of you. And somehow we managed to call that progress. Okay? I don't understand that. That is effectively a destruction of the fabric of society. Because, man was, is a social animal. And now suddenly we had this idea of anonymity. And I'm fully behind the idea of confidentiality and privacy. I'm not convinced that I think we conflate privacy and confidentiality with anonymity too often. And perhaps we have to think about that as we look at the value of the research, the value of collecting information, the value of seeing the patterns, the value of being able to drive from that. Now, as a result of our being able to have everything connected, we've also had one other thing happen, which is we're able to move things in ways that we couldn't before. Okay, in the old days, the only things we could move were analog things. Then at one time we started, it's sad for me to learn that finally this month, India stopped using telegrams. Okay? Until then, we could send telegrams to each other, and it was probably the only country in the world I could see little strips pasted onto, email meets Twitter in an analog form. And people sent telegrams to each other, but now I guess Morse code is going to become one more of those disciplines that we will create retro, but we probably won't use in quite the same form as we used to, although it was a very useful mechanism for its time. But at one time, we learned to send messages through impulses. Then we started learning to actually move voice. It needed some way of encoding and decoding what was happening on either side. So, the codec kind of concept had to be invented. But people started learning to make calls. The telephone is not that new anymore. So rather than just move voice, we learned to move data over time. The modulator, demodulator kind of approach. We learned to move images over time because it was just an exemplar of data moving. And then as we've gone through, the second sort of, besides connectivity, the second big shift for me was the ability to express things in formulaic terms, to represent things, to standardize them, because much of what we've done in learning about the body, the genome, much of what we've learned in many of the disciplines we've gotten to is finding that way to represent something in a manipulable form, standardized, expressible either as a formula or as a set of definitions, because now you can do things you couldn't do earlier. And if you look at what's happening with 3D printing, all we have got to in that sense is the ability to say, can I scan something and represent it mathematically? Can I send that somewhere else? And then can I use those instructions to rebuild what I scanned in some sort of an accretive manner? Because I get a set of instructions that tell me how to build this up. So suddenly, a teleportation is possible. I love vinyl. I'm a retarded hippie, right? So I listen to my music on Valve with vinyl. Tonight I should be at Leonard Cohen. Last week I was at Springsteen. I had to miss Neil Young. But when I started listening to music and I said I love the music of the 60s and 70s, I never realized it meant I'd be listening to musicians in their 60s and 70s. Okay? But that's what it's turned out to be. But the reason I brought that up is one of my dreams to test what's happening with copyright and patents and all that was to say, I want to send an LP to somebody else. When can I have the technology to scan it and to have it faxed over, as it were, and print to the other side? That already happens. It's very William Gibsonish already. The future is here, it's just unevenly distributed. Today, the technology exists for you to be able to scan a vinyl album and to have that replicated at a distance over wires. Okay? It's just very expensive, and it's over time that the driver for that will come down. The costs will start coming down as we get scale. On 3D printing, I only want to have one sort of story shared with you. Nearly a couple of years ago, I was asked to speak at TED at South by Southwest. And I spoke on the idea of information being looked at from the viewpoint of food. If you thought information was food, what would you do differently in how you dealt with information? But the person who spoke after me was going to speak about 3D printing. And when I asked her what she was going to speak on, she showed me her boots. She'd printed the boots, and the boots had an iPhone sleeve. Okay? And I thought to myself, she's going to get crucified at South by if what she's going to be talking about is the vanity of having an iPhone sleeve in her boots. But it turned out that what she was actually going to talk about was the use of 3D printing in being able to make much less painful, much less invasive, much faster, and much more useful the treatment of cleft palates in newborn babies. Okay? Now, cleft palate surgery is one of the most invasive things. The entire face turns black with bruising. Right? It is extremely painful. And her statement was, I think every child has a right to smile. Okay? I tend to agree with her. So when you start thinking of 3D printing and all the uses, right, to me it starts with saying there are some uses for which we have as a collective. Sometimes when you invent something or you innovate, your primary job is to lower the cost of what you're doing so that people can find ways of using it that you have never dreamed of. Okay? If you can help in the creation of scale, then that scale itself creates an opportunity because it reduces the barriers to entry. Right? Wherever I look at any form of invention or innovation, I keep looking for that. Who is being enfranchised as a result? Which barrier is being removed? Because it's a result of those barriers being removed that value gets generated. I now want to move on to sharing very briefly, because all this, the ability to connect and the ability to move things around in a world where everything is growing smaller starts getting valuable only when we have the right attitude to sharing. Now, sharing comes in many ways. When I listen to my vinyl albums, my children look at me and say, Dad, but we can't share it. Okay? Many of the modern generations, part of the value proposition for them is not just the quality of the content, but the ability to share. This is not a bad thing. It's just changing the way people view value. When it comes to sharing, sharing happens because of design. When I was growing up in India, if I was going home and I met some friends and I said, why don't you come and join us for dinner? 3 or 4 friends would come with me. My mother would do some magic in the kitchen, and somehow food expanded to deal with the volume needed. Okay? In England, I tried it. The first time I tried it, my wife looked at me and said, we're having steak. Okay? Not designed to share. Okay? So we have to think about, sharing doesn't happen just because people want to. There has to be an ability to share that is embedded in the way, if you want people to be able to share their experiences, then you need to be able to create environments that people can do the sharing. And this sharing creates ways of value, of creating value. I'm going to give you a completely trivial example. I told you I was a retarded hippie. I love Cat Stevens. Not Yusuf Islam, Cat Stevens. Frozen in time, probably between 1968 and 1973 or so. And I found out that he was going to be returning to his former self at a concert at the Royal Albert Hall a few years ago. So I bought tickets. And then I had the opportunity to share it. Hit a button, lower the cost of sharing, out goes a tweet saying, I've just bought tickets for. And not an auto tweet. I could edit so that it came out in my words and my style. I don't need spam generation. What happened was 3 or 4 days later, somebody from Holland, whom I've never met before and I haven't met yet, got in touch with me via Twitter and said, you saved my life. I've been trying to figure out what to give my wife for her 50th anniversary, for her 50th birthday present. Now we have a secret weekend in London with her at a concert for her favorite artist. And what it taught me was, until then, largely I used to share when I could figure out how value was going to be created from sharing. After that day, I share as long as I know no damage is going to be done from my sharing. Okay? I no longer need to know about the value. I only need to be sure that to the best of my knowledge and ability, there is no damage being done. So you don't give a football score or a cricket score in case someone has time shifted it. You don't give the plot line for a film or a book because someone else may want to read it. So you have to be responsible in your sharing, and you look for these spoilers, but most of the time, share because you can and because you can see it's not going to create damage. And as a result of that, aggregation can take place. And that aggregation leads to be able to visualize patterns. I mean, the kind of learnings that are taking place with how the creation and collection of data, because we have so many sensors, because we have the ability to connect and share, is teaching us things we've never seen before, right? But odd bits like there was a guy who analyzed what the California Highway Patrol was sharing as the debris found on their highways. So every month, the California Highway Patrol would share with the world openly all the debris collected. And I found that the top 2 items were desk chairs and ladders. And a little bit of analysis then proved that the desk chairs were seasonal. They went in one direction when universities opened and another direction when universities closed, because students, for some reason, were not particularly good at tying the chairs to the top of their cars as they went, and then they couldn't stop to pick the chairs up. But the more interesting assertion was to do with the step ladders. The step ladders were for DIY activity, and he proved, this was a guy called Paul Kedrowski, that there was a direct correlation between the dropping away of the numbers of step ladders and the coming financial crunch. Because people were beginning to sort of tighten their belts and a little less activity was taking place. So, when you guys go into these sessions to do with biotech, to do with energy, to do with big data, to do with 3D printing, etc., these may seem streams in themselves. You may be part of research into that environment, you may be part of the startups, you may be investing in it. What I want you to step back and say is, in the end, everything is about trying to make this world a better place. Everything is about trying to reduce barriers to entry, taking out frictions and latencies that would otherwise be there. We have the freedoms to be connected, to be able to have movement and No, not just freedom to connect, but a freedom to move and a freedom to express. The cost of doing these things have all dropped alarmingly and continue to drop alarmingly. And we have the ability, therefore, to get to a micro level, at a nano level in ways we couldn't before, and at a macro level, aggregating, getting the wisdom of crowds in, being able to look at patterns, again in ways that we couldn't before. We have spent forever looking at a reflection of the moon and the water and believing it is the sun, because the cost of finding out the truth has been high. We've used surveys, sampling, questions, rather than true aggregation of what is happening. We now have that ability to aggregate what is happening, and not just that, but we have moved beyond sharing what we did and what we are doing to what we intend to do, right? We are now able, for the first time in human history, to be able to analyze intent, because people are willing to even share that. So I leave you with just 3 thoughts: the freedom to connect, the freedom to move, and the freedom to share. Those 3, underpinned by a digital revolution and public policy, create an environment where each of you can make this world a better place. Thank you for your time.